Such a delight to be using the front lawn after yesterday the gods pleased with us. So yay for the weather. And, you know, every time one comes up to introduce a session, it's normal to say it's an honor to introduce this session. But for me, this particular session is one of the most important because it looks at all the things that we look at in this festival. It examines the session is called The Conflict of Dharma in the Mahabharata, and it examines some of the abiding dilemmas of human existence as they manifest in different situations, be in times past, present, or future. I'll introduce the panelists in a bit, but I do want to introduce the theme a little more first. The Mahabharata is possibly the greatest and most enduring epic of all times. The sheer size of it is daunting. It represents a corpus of 200,000 lines, 8 times the size of the Iliad and the Odyssey put together. It has been the dominant cultural text of the Indian subcontinent, indeed of South Asia, for 2 millennia. At the core of it is the Bhagavad Gita, which is the main religious text of the Hindus. But at the same time, you could say, or people have said, that the philosophy of the Mahabharata itself is more a stoic philosophy of endurance and survival rather than of religious knowledge. It is not a prescriptive text, unlike the Ramayana, which is very clear that it tells you what to do and what not to do. It is a deep and encyclopedic study of human nature, character, and motivation. In that sense, it's a universal text. My own engagement with the Mahabharata happened because many years ago, David Davidar asked me to write a Mahabharata for young children, young readers. And being foolish at that time, I took it on. I said, yes, 6 months deadline, no problem. It took me 2 years, or little less, and those 2 years, I decided never to write again because I said everything that has to be written is written in the Mahabharata. And I think it was a transformational thing for me to write that very simple introduction to the Mahabharata. It has famously been said, whatever is here is found elsewhere, whatever is not here is not to be found anywhere. I won't say that about the Jaipur Literature Festival, but yes, whatever is to be found anywhere is to be found here. And somewhere the philosophy also reminds me of the ancient Roman playwright Terence, who was of North African descent, who famously said, I am human, I consider nothing that is human alien to me. So scholars have often distinguished between the narrative and the didactic strands, but they are fused together in this compelling story. And in my view, it is the pervasive search for dharma that is the main text of the epic. It has been said, dharmanam gatim suksham, the way of dharma is subtle and elusive. It has also been said, dharmasya tattvam nihitam guhayam, or the truth of dharma lies in the dark cave. We are all constantly struggling to know what is the right course of action in any situation. I cannot think of any 2 panelists more qualified to debate this subject. Bibek Debroy is engaged, indeed immersed in both life and literature. He's a writer, he's a scholar, he's an economist, and he has translated the Mahabharata from the critical version of the Bhandarkar Institute. The 10-volume set runs into over 1 million words, I have been told. And he is also a member of the newly constituted Niti Aayog, but here we are speaking to him as a scholar with a deep knowledge of this subject. And I think we are honored to have him here. And leading the Talis is another popular guy, my friend Amish Tripathi, whose best-selling Shiva trilogy has reasserted the centrality of myth and mythic interpretation in modern Indian life. And it's really interesting. He told me long ago, he used to be a banker, and once his son's class teacher asked all the children, what does your daddy do? And he said, my daddy used to be a banker, but now he works for Lord Shiva. And Amish will be announcing his new book series later in the day. The Mahabharata survived as a living text because it is capable of constant reinterpretation and renewal. Plots and subplots are punctuated by stories, situations, and episodes that question the weight of decision, the balance of fate and action. It's constantly throwing up questions for its readers. I'll quote a line or two from Bibek de Broy's introduction. He says, in the Mahabharata, because it is nuanced, we never quite know what is good, what is bad, who is bad. There are degrees along a continuum, but no watertight and neat compartments. And then he says that depending on one's decisions, one faces the consequences, and this brings in the riddle of the tension between free will and determinism, the so-called karma concept. The boundaries of philosophy and religion blur. And he says further, these conflicts over dharma are easy to identify with. It is easy to empathize with the protagonists because we face such conflicts every day. So let us join Bibek de Broy and Amish Tripathi in examining some of the characters, situations, conflicts in the Mahabharata. Why was life so unfair to Karna? Why was Krishna partial to the Pandavas? Why didn't he prevent the war? Why was Abhimanyu killed so unfairly? Why did the spirited Draupadi have to be humiliated publicly? These are part of our living understanding of our lives. They are not some dusty books of myth as in a Western library. Whether it is Arjuna's doubt and irresolution before the war, and whether just so many things. Draupadi's marriage to the 5 brothers, even Yudhishthir found it difficult to convince Drupad about the propriety of such a practice. As Drupad said, a prince must have many wives, but a princess must not have many husbands. In modern times, there's a question of the intelligent and spirited Draupadi's lack of agency over her life. First at being married to the 5 Pandavas after being betrothed only to one, then in being gambled away by her elder husband. Did Yudhishthir, having lost his own freedom, as well as the freedom of his 4 brothers, and having become a slave of the Kauravas, have any right to stake Draupadi? As Draupadi protested and stood up for the rights and autonomy of womanhood in that ancient society, her question was met with silence and sidelong glances. The patriarch Bhishma only recognized that it was a very good point. Let us re-examine this eternal story. This is a transformative text, and I think this will be a transformative session. A very loud clap for my panelists and their subject.
Before I begin, sorry, can you guys hear me? Okay. Before I begin, I must say, what an honor it is to be sharing the stage with Mr. de Broy. I've been a fan of his for many, many years. Firstly, as a lover of myths, as a lover of our culture, of our heritage, Mr. de Broy has done wonderful service to it through the books that he has written, translated, and published. And as a banker, I was a fan of his economic thinking, of your regular reports on the states. So I've been a fan of his, so it's an honor to share the stage with him. How we're going to do this, we discussed this, how we're going to do this is we will speak by ourselves on our understanding of a few of the Mahabharata is so immense in its scope that we can spend many lifetimes discussing what are the lessons to be drawn from it on dharma, on everything else. But what we will do is we'll speak a few of our, a few things that we have understood from it, and we'll see where the conversation goes. And then we'd love to draw you guys into the conversation as well, and you could ask your questions and we'll try our best to answer it. So before I give it to Mr. de Broy to speak his understandings of a few of the understandings of the Mahabharata, I just want to make one short point for you guys, that what is the meaning of the word Hastinapur? In Sanskrit, the word for elephant is Hasti. I'm sure all of you know that. And in ancient times, elephant represented wisdom. Even the story of Lord Ganesh with the elephant head represents him having the immense wisdom of an elephant. So, looked at metaphorically, the word Hastinapur actually means the city of wisdom. The city whose story, when you actually learn and listen, you actually learn wisdom, and each of us can draw our own inspirations, our own understanding of what wisdom is, because each of us are different. And that in a sense is the way to approach Mahabharata. It's to learn what we can, which is relevant for us for this life. That's the way to approach the Mahabharata. That's the way I've always approached this text. So I'm going to give my understandings, a few of the understandings that I've made from it after Mr. Debroy. So over to you, sir.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and Amish, thank you, and thank you for embarrassing me also, so let me reciprocate. Our sons are in the US, they're considerably, they're grown up. So I mentioned to them, I'm coming here to Jaipur, Litfest. Said, who are you with? I said, Amish Tripathi. He said, oh my God, will you please get an autograph? But before talking about the specifics, I want to spend a little bit of time on this elusive word dharma. I dislike it enormously when the word dharma is translated as religion. It is not religion. It is never used in the sense of the word religion, certainly not in the Mahabharata. The word dharma is used in several different senses in the Mahabharata, and quickly let me mention those various senses in which it is used. And it is important to bear this in mind because the usage of the word dharma therefore depends on the context. At one level, it is used in the sense of varnashram dharma, the 4 varnas and the 4 ashramas of life. At another level, it is used in the sense of good behavior, sadachar, good conduct. At a third level, it is used in the sense of what we would today call governance. Let me give you very briefly 2 instances of that. If it is a rich person, you should not imprison for a crime. You should not imprison a rich person for a crime. Because imprisoning that rich person for a crime is a burden on the public exchequer. A monetary penalty should be imposed on a rich person. If there is going to be an imprisonment, that is going to be for a poor person. If I stated this, you would say, this is one of the modern Posner type of law and economics guys who has written this. Of course not. It was stated by Bhishma to Yudhishthira while he was lying down on his bed of arrows. Second instance is civil. For a king, here is a list of 17 kinds of court cases that you must pay attention to in order of priority. And guess what was number 1 in that list that many years ago?
Contract.
It was breach of contract. So dharma is used also in the sense of Raja Dharma, governance, that kind of template. But what is perhaps most important, certainly in the Mahabharata, and of course it is used in the sense of the metaphysical, spiritual, whatever is the expression you want to use. But what is most important for dharma in the Mahabharata is dharma is in the last resort an individual choice. And I can give you countless examples of that, and I hope we can discuss some of those examples where essentially what happens is, here I have got a choice. It is not very evident to me whether this is dharma or that is dharma. There is that conflict. So in the last resort in the Mahabharata, dharma is an individual decision. In that sense, there is no absolute notion of what is right and what is wrong. You take your decision, and as Namita said, you face the consequences. So I think this is important to get the taxonomy out of the way before we begin with the discussion.
Yeah, agree completely, actually very well put, very well put. And yeah, I know I'm aware of what the list of Raj Dharmas that Bhishma had said, and I loved what you said, because in our present society, unfortunately, we don't take contracts that seriously. It was wonderful that at least in those days they did, the ancient Indians did. You know, I'd like to share a few learnings that Yeah, I do. And like I said, you can spend not just one lifetime, you can spend many lifetimes debating the Mahabharata, and that's just one of the many Indian scriptures. But there's, I remember one of my earliest questions. My grandfather was a Pandit from Banaras, and both my parents are very religious, and much of what I know of Indian scriptures I learned from them when I ask questions. And in the traditional Indian way, you are encouraged to ask questions actually. You are not supposed to take anything just because someone has told you to do so. In fact, it's your duty to ask questions. And I remember my earliest memories of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. I would have been maybe 5 or 6. We're a Shaivite family, but my grandfather was a very big devotee of Lord Ram as well. And he used to go in Banaras. Whenever we visited Banaras, he would go to the Asi Ghat, and you take the Ramcharitmanas with him, and he would read, 1 or 2 pages and just do an ucharan, just explain it. And while coming back, and he would take all his grandkids along. While coming back, we'd buy some milk and then go back home. And he used to do that with the Mahabharata as well at home many times. And we won't keep the Mahabharata at home, but he would speak of it. And I remember my earliest question that had come, I think it must have been around 8, 9 or 10 years old, when I'd heard it completely for the first time, the Mahabharata. And the ending made absolutely no sense to me. Because what happened at the end was, if the Mahabharata had ended where the Pandavas, and I'm speaking from the perspective of a 9-year-old, just judge it from that perspective, okay? If the Mahabharata had ended when the Pandavas defeated the Kauravas and they ruled and lived happily ever after, it would be a story with a sense of conclusion, right? Everyone would have been happy. But does the Mahabharata end there? No, it doesn't. It carries on. And what happens after that? Over many years, after many years, the Pandavas decide that actually we are going to go up to Devabhumi, we are going to go up to the heavens. And one by one, first Draupadi, then everyone else, they actually keep falling down. And they're supposed to go, and there's no permanent hell in, in the Indian way. There's kind of like a purgatory where you cleanse your karma and you come back up. And they keep falling down except for Yudhishthir himself, who actually goes all the way up to heaven. And who does he find there? He finds Duryodhan and the Kauravas out there in heaven. And I remember the first time I heard it, my reaction was, what? What sense does this make? What is the point of the entire battle? If he's gone up out there and these guys are in heaven and the guys who are on the good side are down in hell, what's going on? And I was thoroughly confused. And I remember asking my parents, I remember asking my Baba that, what sense does this make, yaar? And then my grandfather told me, he said, think about the Ramayana as well. Even the Ramayana at the end actually leaves you thinking, what happened? Why did someone who was so obsessed with his wife, why did he just leave her? And this is not just the way stories are told in the Mahabharata and Ramayana as well. It actually comes in many Indian stories. And there's a perspective that I was told by my elders, that the approach in Indian stories is not to leave you with a sense of conclusion at the end. Because if you have a sense of conclusion, then you stop thinking about the story. The brown paper has been put on it, it's been sealed, the ribbon has been tied, and you put it aside. The story should leave you troubled. It should leave you with more questions at the end than you had at the beginning. And you should actually be thinking, what happened? Why did it happen this way? And the perspective is through the questions that emerge with not receiving a sense of conclusion, you will find answers. And you will find philosophies that make sense to you. And he says that this is the way to approach Indian stories actually. They are supposed to leave you with questions. And your questions can be different from my questions, that's okay. Your answers can be different from my answers, that's also okay. Why? Because you are different from me. Right? If two people are exactly similar, then frankly one of them is not required. Right? All of us are different because that's the way the universe has designed it. And the perspective is to find your own questions, to find your own answers. And that's the way one should look at the stories, that it leaves you with thought starters. Okay? Now if you approach it from this perspective, there are some questions that I thought I could raise. One, on the perspective of what is good karma? What Mr. Debroy said is very right, that one of the things to debate is what is dharma, and sadly many of us don't understand dharma itself. It is translated straight into religion. There are actually many more deeper meanings to it. But what is karma as well? We see karma as our action, right? But what defines a good karma? All of us want to, I'm sure, at least I hope, all of us want to do good karma. Why? Because it will help our soul, it will keep our soul unsoiled. But how do you know that what you are doing is good karma or not? Let's look at the perspective of Bhishma. He's a character who is highly respected in the Mahabharata. And I am not saying I don't respect him, but I am saying let's look at his approach. His father Shantanu gives in to his lower self and falls in love. Sorry, there's nothing wrong with falling in love, don't get me wrong. That's not a part of your lower self, that's a part of your higher self. I'm sorry everyone, I love my wife a lot, you know, she might hear this, she might kill me. Okay, falling in love is a part of your higher self. The question is, what do you do when you have actually fallen in love? Shantanu was willing to do something which he knew was not in the interest of his kingdom. He knew it was in the interest of his kingdom if Bhishma became the king, because Bhishma would have been a damn good ruler. But he was so much in love that he gave in to the condition that his wife put in, that Bhishma will not be king and that her sons will become kings. He gave in to that lower self. What should have been good karma for Bhishma to do? Was it good of him to give in to his father? Was it good of him? There are many of us who think yes, it was perhaps. He was a good son, right? Or should he have actually challenged his father? Because he was not challenging his father, he was challenging his father's lower self. Good piano, yeah? Okay. He was actually challenging his father's lower self. And he would have probably told his father, behave with your higher self. You are a king before a man, right? What is the right thing to do? Should he have actually challenged his father and said, I know I will be a better king, I know it will be good for the people, so I am not giving up? Would that have actually been better? Would many of the battles that happened later, maybe they wouldn't have happened? So now what is good karma for Bhishma? Was it the fact that he gave in to his father? Or did he actually do bad karma by giving in to his father? And then the corollary to it is good karma defined by intentions or outcomes? Let's quote a modern example outside of the Mahabharata. The Nobel Peace Prize, for example. One assumes that the Nobel Peace Prize is given to those who have good karma, right? I mean, one assumes that if they receive the Nobel Peace Prize, they must have done something good, right? Let's consider the example of Liu Xiaobo. Sorry. I never get the Chinese pronunciations right, sorry. If there's a Chinese gentleman out here, please correct me. Liu Xiaobo was given the Nobel Peace Prize by the Nobel, I don't know what they're called, Nobel Peace Prize Committee. And if you read the interviews of Liu Xiaobo, clearly he has very good intentions. He's a good person. He says good things. But what is the outcomes of what he's done? Has he actually had a real impact on the Chinese people, on a large number of Chinese people? Perhaps we are forced to conclude maybe not, right? Now consider the Chinese Communist Party. They're a highly cynical organization, and like most political parties, they have only one objective: they want to remain in power, right? But with that cynical intention, they have raised 680 million people out of poverty. They have had a real impact on the Chinese people. So now, whose karma was good? The Chinese Communist Party or Liu Xiaobo? Right? Liu Xiaobo's intentions are very good. Chinese Communist Party's intentions are kind of cynical, but consider the outcomes. Now these are complex questions. I mean, I might have my own answer, you may have your own answer. And these are the things which Mahabharata forces us to confront if we go a little deeper beyond just the story itself. This is a thought that I had. Mr. Debroy, if you have.
Let me sort of just build on what Amish said, and I will add 2 examples. But before that, I think the reason the Mahabharata appeals to all of us, even today, and certainly appeals to me, is because we ask the question that Amish mentioned. Why did he or she take this particular decision? And would I have taken that decision given that situation? Some of the obvious conflicts of dharma I will leave aside because they are known, whether it is Bhishma, why was life unfair to Karna, what about Draupadi, wasn't it a bit unfair to Duryodhana also? Let me leave all of that aside and perhaps mention three incidents, one just for the record. The one that's just for the record is, if one is looking for really spirited women in the Mahabharata, it is not Draupadi. Of course she is, don't get me wrong. But the most spirited person, lady in the Mahabharata is Shakuntala.
Oh yeah.
Do not look at Shakuntala from the eyes of Kalidasa.
Yeah.
Kalidasa's Shakuntala is
Very
considerably different from the Mahabharat's Shakuntala. But the two instances, the first instance, well, Amish mentioned Bhishma. Everyone here knows that Bhishma had taken a vow of brahmacharya, being celibate. In this kind of situation, he confronts a princess from Kashi, Amba. And to cut the long story short, Amba wants Bhishma to marry her and says that if you don't marry her, I will immolate myself by flinging myself into the fire. Bhishma says, sorry my dear, I have a vow of brahmacharya. I cannot marry you. Amba kills herself, becomes Shikhandi, etc. Bhishma was a Kshatriya. Some of you, if not all of you, will know that Arjuna, who was also a Kshatriya, had a temporary vow of brahmacharya for 1 year. During that course of 1 year, he meets the Naga princess Ulupi. Ulupi falls in love with Arjuna and says, please marry me. Arjuna says, sorry, I can't, my dear, I have got a vow of brahmacharya. Ulupi says, you have to make up your mind. Is protecting brahmacharya more important, or is protecting the life of a lady more important? Because if you don't marry me, I am going to kill myself. And what does Arjuna do? Arjuna marries Ulupi. This is the reason I said at the beginning that if you look at the Mahabharata, it is beyond Varnashram Dharma. Both were Kshatriyas. But let me give you the other example, which in some ways is my favorite, and I invoke it whenever people say, hey, Bibek Deb Roy, you are immersed in the Mahabharata, how come you are not a vegetarian? How come you drink? This is the story I tell them then. And this story concerns the sage Vishwamitra. Indra was angry. We don't need to get into the reason as to why he was angry. He was angry, so for 12 years it did not rain. For 12 years it did not rain, there was a drought, there was famine, there was no food to be had. And the sage Vishwamitra could not find food to feed himself, to feed his wife, to feed his children. So he went traveling around looking for food. He comes upon a village of Chandalas. And Chandalas are not the same as Shudras. So let me use the word Chandala. He comes upon a village of Chandalas. In that village, he finds the house of a Chandala. Chandalas, by the way, always were in the company of dogs. There is the Chandala, there is his house, there is the courtyard, there is a rope slung across the courtyard, and on that rope is slung half a carcass of a dog, which the Chandala has killed, eaten half of it, and the hind quarters are slung on that rope. The sage Vishwamitra waits. He waits for the Chandala to go to sleep, because then he plans to steal this carcass of the dog, take it away and feed his wife and children. The Chandala goes to sleep, the sage Vishwamitra begins to steal it, but the Chandala also has the dog which is alive. That dog wakes up, begins to yap, all the other dogs begin to yap. So the Chandala wakes up and says, "Who are you?" Vishwamitra says, "I am the sage Vishwamitra." Chandala says, "I bow down before you, what can I do for you?" Vishwamitra says, "I want to steal this, I want to feed my wife, children, etc." For about 10 chapters, there is now this discourse between Vishwamitra and the Chandala. With the Chandala arguing, "You are a Brahmana, you should certainly not eat flesh. If you eat flesh, you should certainly not eat flesh that has been contaminated by association with a Chandala. If you eat flesh that has been contaminated by association with a Chandala, you should certainly not eat the flesh of a dog. And if you eat the flesh of a dog that has been contaminated by association with a Chandala, you should certainly not eat the hindquarters, which is inauspicious." Vishwamitra initially says, "Dharma comes later, first let me survive. If I don't survive, there is no dharma." Eventually he comes up with an answer to which the Chandala has no answer, which is, "Who am I? Am I this physical body or am I the Atman? If I am the Atman, then who is eating this flesh? It is the physical body that is eating the flesh, and how is my Atman contaminated?" The Chandala says, "Please go ahead." It's a separate matter that the composer of the Mahabharata never really had the courage to make the sage Vishwamitra eat the dog's flesh, so Indra began to shower down.
So I was thinking, should we open up for a few questions, or you want to discuss? Okay. Okay, it seems there are questions already. If there's, sorry? Okay. Okay. It's okay. We'll carry on for a bit more, and then we'll open it up for some questions. Okay. So, how about if I speak of something else, which an interesting. It's a small insight. I was kind of discussing it with my family. I think many months, in fact, perhaps many years ago. There is this story, and this is all, I mean, going into what is personally right for you to do. You know, is it listening to your parents or doing what is the correct karma for you? So let me just debate this once again. And all of us know the story of Yayati, right? He grew old, and for whatever reasons, we won't get into that. And he had this, he suggested to two of his children that, "Will you exchange your youth with me? You know, so I can become young and enjoy youth once again, and you remain old for some time. And then when I've had enough and I want to die, I'll return your youth to you." So there were two sons he discussed this with. One was, of course, Yadu, who was elder than Puru. There were 5 sons, but this was only about Yadu and Puru. Yadu said, "No, man. I mean, you've lived your life, and for you to steal my life is wrong. So no, this is not happening." Then he went to Puru, and Puru was the good boy. He was the good son, and he immediately said, "Yes, Dad. You know, whatever you want. Let's exchange it." And of course, Yayati became young, and he enjoyed his life. Puru became old, and after many years, when Yayati had had enough, he exchanged youth and old age once again with Puru. Now, because of this, we are told, one of the interpretations is that Yayati was very happy with Puru, right? That you are a good son. So I bless you. You and your children will always remain kings, right? You will have the blessing of royalty upon you all the time. And Yadu, the disobedient son, the bad boy, he's told, not only you, but even your descendants will suffer, right? They may not become kings as well. this is the story that we are told is the reason why in the Mahabharata at the end, the Yadavs, who are the descendants of Yadu, destroy themselves in a catastrophic civil war, whereas the Pandavas, who were the descendants of Puru, they continue ruling. This is the interpretation that we are told, and I am not challenging the facts. I am just suggesting perhaps we are not looking at all the facts. Let us consider all the facts. There is no doubt that Puru and his descendants certainly became great kings, and for a time they were among the most powerful kings in India, no doubt about it. But did the Yadus actually completely get destroyed? Among the descendants of Yadu was Kartavirya Arjun, who at one time was one of the most powerful kings in the world. Among his descendants was Lord Krishna himself, right? God himself took an avatar among the descendants of Yadu. So was Yadu actually cursed? And let us think about the end of the Mahabharata, right? At the end of it, of course, all the Kauravas are killed, right? So they don't become kings, or rather they don't continue to be kings. So who becomes the kings? The Pandavas. But after some time, the Pandavas also die out. And at the end, who becomes the king? At the end, when Yudhishthira gives up his throne, it's Parikshit. Parikshit is the son of Abhimanyu. Now who is Abhimanyu the son of? He is the son of Arjun and Subhadra. Who is Arjun the son of? Indra, who had nothing to do with Puru, and Kunti. Kunti is a Yadav. She was from the Yadu clan. So actually if you have to think about what blood was there in Arjun, it was actually Yadu blood. And who was Abhimanyu's mother? Does anyone know? Subhadra. Great. A applause for her. Subhadra. And Subhadra was also a Yadu. She was also a Yadav. So actually if you want to look at it from a perspective, Parikshit was actually a Yadu. So the Yadus actually came back to become kings. So did Yayati's curse actually work? No. Now what is the interpretation of this? Should you disobey your dad or should you not disobey your dad? Now you do what feels right to you, but what you have to understand is that what happens to you is decided by your karma. It is not decided by what your ancestors may have done. It is decided what you may have done, perhaps in your previous life, perhaps in this life. So the way I approach it is, if you are lucky that your parents don't do anything which is adharmic, don't oppose them. If your parents do something that's adharmic, you should oppose them. There's nothing wrong with that, right? You should do what is right for you. Now the question again to ponder is, what is right for you? If we go back to what is good karma, the whole problem is this whole damn thing is too complicated. So, yeah.
Let me react to obeying your dad, and then I have a substantive point to make.
Yeah, but I should say I obey my dad.
There was a sage who was prone to anger.
Durvasa?
No.
Acha.
And he had a son who was named Chirakarika.
Okay.
The son was named Chirakarika because Chirakarika took a long time to do anything. He kept thinking, should I do it, should I not do it, should I do it, should I not do it. The sage, in a fit of anger, instructs his son Chirakarika, kill your mother, and goes off on a pilgrimage. And Chirakarika is sitting there wondering, should I obey my father? I must. Should I kill my mother? I should not. The sage comes back after 1 year. By then, the sage is despondent because he's got over his anger, he does not want his wife actually to be killed, and he comes back and he finds Chirakarika still standing there with the sword in his hand. And Chirakarika says, I am still thinking. So the sage blesses him and says, everyone who takes a long time will henceforth be blessed. But I want to make a substantive point. And the substantive point is this. that when we look at the Mahabharata, let's not forget that it was written thousands of years ago. And therefore, let us not use today's value judgments and today's norms and today's lens to judge what was right and what was wrong. Also do realize the Mahabharata was composed in layers over hundreds of years.
Yeah.
So within the Mahabharata also there are inconsistencies in this sense. I can cite chapter and verse from the Mahabharata to show, to demonstrate that women were exceedingly liberated. And I can cite chapter and verse to show that women were extremely oppressed. But the substantive point, well, let me give two quick examples of that. One is, all of us are familiar with this incident of Draupadi being dragged to the assembly hall and being disrobed. Two quick things about that incident. It's been depicted any number of times in films, calendar art, Raja Ravi Verma, you name it. What is Draupadi clad in? She is clad in a sari. For God's sake, did women in that day and age wear saris? No, they did not. Men and women, regardless, wore two pieces of garment. One below the waist, one above the waist. Except that people who were servants were not entitled to wear that upper garment. Before this Draupadi incident happens, the 5 male Pandavas, having lost their independence, had already surrendered their upper garments. It is after that that the Draupadi incident happens. The second thing is, if you remember, or some of you will remember, when she is dragged to that assembly hall, Duryodhan ostensibly bears his thigh, and that is invariably interpreted by us as a sign of obscenity. In that day and age, the right thigh and the right part of the lap was meant for the daughter or the daughter-in-law. The left thigh or the left lap was meant for the wife, left side. By the way, if you are going to go pose in if you are going to go pose in a photo studio with your fiancée who then becomes your wife, be careful. If it's the fiancée on the right, once she has become the wife on the left, the wife is Bama. And you will see it in portrayals of Shiva's marriage. But to come back to what I was saying, all that Duryodhan was saying was, come and be my wife. No trace of obscenity in the description of that incident whatsoever. Simple point, if one is going to appreciate the Mahabharata, please read it in its entirety. If you read abridged versions, you will miss out on several of these nuances.
You know, absolutely spot on. If I may just support this, if you guys, you know, this tradition of actually the left and the right has been forgotten now. If you actually go and see ancient temples, and I am talking about temples that survive, say, of the Gupta era or anything, you will find gods and goddesses, if they are shown together, if the goddess is the wife of the god, she will be sitting on his left thigh. And it's the way it was supposed to be. It's symbolic of your wife. But today we've forgotten it so much that even in popular culture we don't really understand this and we confuse it. How many of you guys are from Andhra Pradesh? So few. Okay. There's this movie called Magadhira. Have you guys seen it? Chiranjeevi, I'd seen it. I'd seen the Hindi dubbed version of it. And there's a part of it where it's in the ancient times. And there's this guy who's the villain who comes and tells the princess that you're going to be mine now. And he sits down and he pats his right thigh. Okay. And he's essentially asking her to be his daughter, you know, in the traditional way. But it's just that we've forgotten the symbology of Duryodhan that we actually think this is what the Mahabharata is telling us. It's not actually. It's about the left side. Yeah, absolutely spot on.
Now I think we should.
Now we should open it to questions. So, and we'll try our best to answer. Someone will go around with a mic. And this, the gentleman in the coat, what's your name, buddy? Atul. So Atul, and what's your name? Radhika. Excuse me. Atul and Radhika are the most powerful people in the
Vivek,
lawns now, and they will ask questions.
I have a question for you, a serious one. If you're a bachelor, you don't have a wife, and you don't have a fiancé, and you don't have a daughter or daughter-in-law, which lap are you supposed to use?
Are you asking me whether male laps were sanctioned? Not in the Mahabharata, not in the Mahabharata. But look, again, I will go back to what I said earlier. The Mahabharata says very clearly that the institution of marriage did not exist until a certain point in time.
Yeah.
Women were free to go with whoever they chose. Birth was determined by maternity, which was always certain, and never by paternity, which is uncertain even today. Then a sage named Shetaketu instituted the system of marriage because he suddenly discovered his mother was being summoned by a strange man and she was going away with him. So Shetaketu went to his father and said, "What on earth is this?" And his father said, "Well, this is the way it is." Shetaketu said, "Nothing doing. We must have an institution of marriage." However, let me also say that the notion of adultery is a completely modern notion. There was no notion of adultery as we understand it today, certainly not in the Mahabharata.
No, and even if you look in some of the Smritis, if you read the Yajnavalkya Smriti, the Devala Smriti, the child was recognized as the son of the husband of the woman, not necessarily the biological father. And it was clearly laid out in many of the Smritis. Yeah. Whoever has the mic, this Atul is the man, and Radhika. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you. You referred to the dog, but when you amiss the dog, the eating of the flesh of the dog.
No, that was him. But go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. When Yudhishthira is coming to the heaven, he is not coming alone.
He's followed by a dog.
Is also a dog.
Yes.
Then about the burning of the Khandava forest, you are referring to the disrobing of Draupadi, but the original violence is the burning of the Khandava forest. What is your perspective on it?
You want?
I am not sure which part of that was a comment and which part was a question. The dog that went with Yudhishthira to heaven was not really a dog, it was Dharma disguised as a dog.
True.
There is an actual instance of a dog which went to heaven. I will not tell you the story because I guess we are running out of time. This is a dog named Lubdhak. You will see it up there in the sky as the star Sirius.
Yeah.
Now, so far as the Khandava part was concerned, I am not going to use the word violence. Khandava was just an attempt to clear up, in my view, to clear up a wilderness for the sake of habitation. That is all it was, which had symbolic nuances within the Khandava story. There is the story of the Nagas, let me not get into that, but fundamentally all that was happening was an area that was a forest tract was being cleared up.
Whoever has the mic. Yeah. Hi.
No? Okay. My question is to Amish. You mentioned that Indian tradition actually encourages questioning of whatever we are told, but actually isn't it the other way? If you look at our pujas, the way we do our rituals, most of the time, everything has to be done with the right pronunciation, the right intonation. Don't ask questions. This is the way it's done. It's always been done this way. So I'm intrigued by your assertion that it encourages questioning.
Let me quote something from the Bhagavad Gita, from the 18th chapter. I'm sure you are aware, Bhagavad Gita is actually an allegory. Lord Krishna's, and we kind of represent Arjun. those who are confused, who are seeking answers. And Lord Krishna is speaking to us through Arjuna. There is this lovely line in there where Lord Krishna tells Arjun that I have given you knowledge most profound. Now your task is to think about it and then do what you think is right. Right? There's what he's essentially saying is that he doesn't have to agree with what God is telling him as well. He has to question, he has to think and do what he thinks is right. Right? If God didn't want you to use your brain, he wouldn't have blessed you with one. Right? Let's consider another story. This story comes from the south. You would have heard of the ancient saint called Kanna. There's a story that apparently he was a hunter when he was in his pre-saint days. And he was a devout, Shiva worshipper, Lord Shiva worshipper. And he used to go every day to a small Shiva temple where there was a Shivling, and he used to carry prasad with him. Lord Shiva likes bilva leaves. He would carry some meat, part of his hunt, and he didn't have enough, space to carry water. So he used to carry water in his mouth, okay? And he used to go to the Shivling and put the meat, offer the bilva, and he would spit the water out, okay, on the Shivling. Now there was also a priest out there, a Brahmin, who was following all the exact rituals as they are prescribed. Who do you think Lord Shiva blessed? And the answer is obvious, but he blessed the hunter. Why? Because the hunter was doing it with a clean heart. He wasn't thinking about anything else. He was pure in his devotion to Lord Shiva, whereas the priest was looking at the hunter. What the hell is this guy doing? Why is he doing this? Why is he not doing this? He wasn't focused on his own devotion.
Yeah? Can I just add to that a little bit?
Sure.
I'm just going to add to what Amish has already said from the Bhagavad Gita, and it's high time someone quoted the Bhagavad Gita. There is a shloka in the Bhagavad Gita which is applicable to any teacher, any preceptor, including Krishna, and that shloka says, Pariprashnena pranipatena sevaya. Ask, bow down and serve. Notice the first part is pariprashnena. Then comes pranipatena and finally comes sevaya. So questioning is very much a part of the description / discourse.
There's an interpretation of the Mahabharata in which the Pandavas represent the 5 senses and the Kauravas represent the rest of the body. So they're saying that it's an internal conflict. So what are your thoughts on that, and how does that relate to dharma?
You're right, that interpretation does exist. How old are you?
15.
Sorry?
15.
My God, smart question, yeah, for a 15-year-old. India is in good hands. Okay. Yeah, you're right, that interpretation does exist. That the Pandavas and the Kauravas essentially represent the senses, the values within us. In that sense, for example, Karna at times is thought to represent a sense of victimhood for not having received what you think you deserve, whereas Arjun represents a sense of gratitude for receiving more than what you think you deserve. And actually, if you look at yourself internally, your sense of gratitude can kill your sense of victimhood. Because all of us in some areas of life receive less than what we deserve. In some areas of life, we receive more than what we deserve. And we should have a sense of gratitude for what, So which is why Arjun kills Karna. There is an interpretation like this. And I think it's certainly worth exploring. My family and I, we debate on this approach a lot as well. My sister had actually written an article on this once in Speaking Tree, if I'm not. My sister is here somewhere. And she's the smart one in the family. Actually, everyone in my family is smarter than I am. Whoever has the mic. Yes. Siddharth.
I have 2 short questions for Mr. De Broglie. Why do Indians not like to have the Mahabharata in their homes? Number 1. Number 2, what are your thoughts on Peter Brook's Mahabharata?
Number 1, that belief is localized in some parts of India. I don't think it's universal. I have several versions of the Mahabharata at home. I don't think it has done any damage. In fact, I think it's been good for us, for the entire family. On the Peter Brooks, and this links up to the, in a way to the, my response would be very similar to the question she asked. What I like about the Mahabharata is you don't have to take anyone else's interpretation. You can find your own, and you will find your own, because the answer is not there in the text, the answer is inside you. So far as Peter Brooks is concerned, my take is the more attempts there are to popularize the Mahabharata, I think the better it is. So whether it is Amish doing it, Devdutt doing it, I doing it, Amar Chitrakatha doing it, Namita doing it, Shashi doing it, all of us I think are serving this broader cause of persuading people to read the Mahabharata. And that is a tradition we shouldn't lose out.
And just to add, sorry, go ahead.
The book reads you. Okay, I might not like the phrasing, but yes.